His mother is still breathing. I saw her at the refuse yard. Are you certain?
Are you certain? Tell me the truth, every last detail.
The impoverished child shouted at the millionaire, "Your mother is alive." I witnessed it with my own eyes, and what transpired next completely transformed his destiny forever. Settle back and allow this profoundly moving, deeply touching narrative to wash over you. I sincerely hope this story provides you with inspiration, a sense of well-being, and a renewed appreciation for empathy as you hear it, and ultimately may it serve as the perfect gentle nudge toward a restful night's sleep. Let's get started. Ethan Ward had just wrapped up the final segment of the community outreach event. He stood in the worn-out courtyard of the Everglade Community Center, talking with his assistant to finalize the remaining logistics. Around him, local residents were still lined up receiving essential supplies, while the accompanying media team meticulously documented every moment for the charitable campaign that he and Helena, his stepmother, had been sustaining for months. Helena maintained a strategic position just behind Ethan's shoulder, constantly adjusting her posture and gaze, ensuring she kept an eye on the camera lenses while making absolutely sure no detail compromised the image of the perfect philanthropic family she was so intent on crafting. Ethan, naturally composed, kept his focus on the people surrounding him rather than the cameras, which made him the effortless, authentic centerpiece of these outreach events. As he prepared to leave the courtyard, the motorcade drivers pulled the vehicles right up to the designated parking line, and the security detail began forming a clear pathway for him and Helena to exit. Ethan was just about to take the first step when a sudden urgent movement from the corner of the waiting line made him turn back. A frail young girl darted out of the crowd. Her threadbare shoes scraped loudly against the concrete as she struggled past the human barrier, making a beeline straight toward Ethan. The security personnel immediately reached out to intercept her, concerned about a potential commotion, but the girl squeezed through the narrow gap between the two guards. Ethan looked closer and recognized the familiar face. It was Sophie, the daughter of Maria, the housekeeper who had been closely devoted to his mother, Linda Ward, for a long time, before Maria left the household following Linda's abrupt passing. Ethan took a deliberate step forward, signaling his security team to hold back, and Sophie immediately seized the opportunity. She raised her small arm high even before her breath could stabilize, then quickly closed the distance to Ethan. Her rushed actions caused everyone nearby to pause and shift their attention to them. "Sophie, what is it? What brings you here?" Ethan asked, bending down to get a better look at her distressed face. Sophie didn't wait a second longer. Whatever compelled her to rush here felt too immediate for any careful explanation. "Mr. Ethan, your mother didn't pass away like everyone claims. I saw her at the Westford dumping ground. She's terribly weak, and my mother told me I had to find you before someone discovered that we saw her." The words spilled out rapidly, one after the other, each one landing on Ethan in a way that rooted him to the spot. His face softened slightly, not with relief, but with unconcealed confusion. For the past 18 months, he had believed Linda had succumbed to a critical health complication. All the paperwork and notifications had been presented to him by Helena and her medical team. He had never once questioned it, until this exact moment. Helena immediately stepped in, intentionally pulling Ethan back by the arm with a subtle but firm gesture. "You shouldn't get too close. Let the staff handle this." The child might have been persuaded by someone. She said, her voice low but loud enough for the media crew to catch. Helena signaled for the program's deputy manager to approach and demanded order, all while shooting a sharp glance at the film crew, ensuring they avoided any close-ups of this specific area. However, Ethan didn't turn in the direction Helena tried to steer him. Sophie dug into her coat pocket and pulled out an object so familiar that Ethan lost all control over his facial expression. It was the silver hair clip engraved with the initials LW, the very item Linda always wore when she went out. The clip was dulled with dust, and the edges showed old streaks of grime as if it had been dragged or knocked against a rough surface. Ethan took the item, placed it in the palm of his hand, and leaned in close to examine every etched detail, every minor imperfection. He didn't need confirmation from anyone. This was the keepsake his mother had kept since he was a child. He maintained silence for only a few seconds, but in that brief time, the hundreds of people around them began to murmur. They could see the profound shift in his eyes, and that change was precisely what Helena did not want. Enough, Ethan. Don't let some baseless rumor complicate today's work, Helena said, grabbing his arm again, trying to physically pull him away. But Ethan gently brushed her hand aside, not with frustration, but with the instinct of a person who had just sensed that something had been fundamentally wrong for a very long time. Sophie took another step forward. My mother is hiding at the end of this street. Someone is keeping an eye on her. My mother said if I didn't alert you right away, we wouldn't get another chance. Her voice was steady, but her body was tense, hands clasped tightly together as if bracing herself against the threat that was closing in on her and her mother. A security guard stepped forward, intending to move Sophie back to gain control of the situation, but Ethan waved them off. He tucked the hair clip into his coat pocket and looked directly at Sophie. "Where is Maria now?" Ethan asked, and Sophie pointed toward the end of the street where a row of old neglected buildings stood, an area no one from the outreach team had paid any attention to. She pointed while nervously scanning the surroundings as if fearing someone might appear unexpectedly. "My mother told me to get to you immediately because she saw a familiar person near the dumping ground yesterday. She's worried they'll locate her sooner than anticipated." At that exact moment, Helena called her assistant closer, her voice clipped sharp and laden with tension. Ethan couldn't hear the exact words, but he noticed her unusually strained demeanor. Her eyes quickly darted around to see if anyone was paying attention to their exchange, and that very moment solidified the acute sense of dread that had risen within Ethan. The nearby residents began to cluster, having noticed that Ethan no longer wore his usual composed expression. Several reporters edged closer, trying to capture images, even though no actual dialogue was being shouted out. The gestures and expressions were enough to signal that this story had taken an unexpected turn. Helena retreated a step, attempting to regain control by urging the program staff to move the vehicles to a different spot, intending to separate them from the crowd. However, Ethan walked in the opposite direction. She desired, heading straight for where Sophie stood. "Take me to your mother," he commanded, extending a gentle hand to reassure the girl as they walked off together. Sophie glanced back one last time before leading Ethan across the small dirt path that branched into the low-income neighborhood at the far end of the courtyard. She moved quickly, clearly anxious, constantly twisting her head to check if anyone was following them. Ethan stayed close, maintaining just enough distance to shield her if anything were to happen. As the two moved away from the congested area, the noise behind them gradually faded. Helena still stood by the vehicle watching them with an entirely different look, one that lacked the soft altruism of the outreach event. She pulled out her phone once more and spoke briefly into it, then slammed the car door shut with force, as if attempting to contain her rising instability. Ethan didn't look back. He stepped off the curb with Sophie leaving the busy courtyard full of people and actively filming cameras behind him. The security personnel hesitated, unsure whether to follow, as Helena was no longer focused on issuing commands. A heavy silence descended, as if the lively charity event had just been shrouded in an unsettling new atmosphere. Ethan moved swiftly, following Sophie, leaving behind the chaotic courtyard where camera operators were still attempting to hold their frame despite Helena's efforts to dissuade them. The small girl rushed ahead but kept turning her head as if afraid the noise behind them might pull Ethan back into Helena's orbit. As they rounded the corner onto the narrow lane leading to the motorcade staging area, Ethan heard Helena call his name with an urgent tone, but he didn't stop to respond. He simply opened the car door, helped Sophie into the passenger seat, circled to the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking spot, the sound of the engine effectively muffling Helena's renewed call. Sophie fastened her seatbelt, clasped her hands together, and remained quiet for a beat. Ethan looked ahead, though he leaned in slightly to hear her as the car slowly rolled away from the small street. "Why was your mother in hiding? And why did it take you this long to get to me?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, though his gaze frequently darted toward Sophie's expression. She sighed, as if preparing to recount something that even she was hesitant to hear again. My mother left your house after Ms. Linda passed, and even then she didn't believe how everything unfolded. She insisted Ms. Linda was generally healthy. It was just a minor relapse of an old ailment, not the critical state people claimed. My mother wanted to tell you, but she had no proof, just a feeling that was hard to explain to anyone. Ethan steered onto the main road, struggling to maintain a steady speed despite the twisting knot in his stomach. What kind of feeling, he pressed. She said everything at the clinic happened too fast. The records were pre-prepared, and family wasn't allowed to see her one last time due to health safety protocols. My mother thought it was strange, but she didn't dare speak up because Helena was managing everything then. The mention of Helena caused Ethan to instinctively grip the steering wheel tighter, and Sophie continued her account. My mother kept silent until she went out to the Westford area to collect recyclables. That day, she saw a group of people hauling a gurney off a refuse collection vehicle. She didn't pay much attention at first, but when she looked closer, she realized the person on the gurney was Ms. Linda. The statement made Ethan turn his head and look at Sophie longer than usual, before returning his focus to the road. Sophie pulled her small backpack closer, searching inside for a crumpled piece of paper, but not retrieving it as if it were a comfort item. My mother said Ms. Linda was still taking shallow breaths, very fragile, but still her. She didn't dare call anyone, afraid of being caught. As she backed away, 2 men nearby were talking. One told the other, "Helena wants everything wrapped up tonight." After hearing that my mother fled the area immediately because she understood that Ms. Linda didn't pass away due to illness, Ethan swallowed the sudden tightness in his throat, allowing the image of his mother to flood his memory once more. He wasn't allowed to see her one last time. Everything was arranged by Helena within hours. Helena had told him the physician didn't want him to be traumatized by seeing his mother so frail. He had believed her, and now that very belief made him feel like he was being dragged backward into a truth fabricated by someone else. "Did Maria mention who was monitoring her?" Ethan asked. Sophie nodded. After she overheard that conversation, my mother started seeing strangers around our boarding house. Sometimes they stood near the stairs. Sometimes they parked a dark-colored vehicle near the entrance, acting as if they were waiting for her to step out. She suspected they realized she knew too much. She kept moving locations constantly because she didn't want me involved in this. Ethan slowed down to avoid the glare of an oncoming vehicle sweeping across the windshield, and he meticulously stitched together every detail Sophie recounted, searching for any missing piece. He recalled Helena taking charge of all clinic communications, signing all the relevant documents, and notifying the family. He remembered Helena telling him that all procedures were completed and that Ethan should focus on running the company. Now he re-examined those fragments and saw them connect into a pattern that was far from straight. "Where is Maria now?" Ethan asked next. Sophie pointed forward. "You drive straight toward the old market area. Then you turn into the narrow path behind the vintage repair shop. My mother's in a small room inside. She hasn't dared to leave since she heard unfamiliar footsteps below the window." Ethan accelerated just enough to bridge the silent gaps in their journey. Sophie leaned back in her seat, but her eyes never left the road ahead. She cautiously checked behind them, through the mirror, as if every movement of the car might draw something dangerous in their wake. As the car reached the intersection leading to the market area, Ethan decelerated to observe the surroundings. Rows of abandoned shops appeared on both sides. Cracked window panes plastered with old warning tape made the place feel even more desolate. Sophie pointed toward a row of businesses with a broken leaning sign and signaled for Ethan to stop next to a corner wall. Ethan turned off the engine but kept his hand on the key, a deep unease settling in his chest. Just as they opened the car doors, a sound echoed from the far end of the street, and a dark sedan unexpectedly turned in and skidded to a stop right before a curve. Sophie flinched and instinctively grabbed Ethan's arm. "See that it's the same type of vehicle that showed up a few times outside the boarding house where Mom and I stayed." Ethan observed the sedan for a few seconds to determine if the occupants were actively tracking them or if it was merely a coincidence. The sedan remained stationary, neither advancing nor retreating, as if calculating whether to proceed. Ethan placed his hand on Sophie's back and ushered her into the narrow hallway that led into the market complex. "Let's go." "Show me the way," Ethan said quickly. Sophie nodded and slipped into the crumbling, weathered side path. Ethan followed, glancing back at the sedan, which was now slowly inching forward, apparently looking for space to turn around. The hallway was cramped, the light filtering in dim because the old awning was covered by decaying wooden planks. Sophie guided Ethan past tightly shut doors, spaces that had once been small shops but were now just bare cement floors and warped door frames. "My mother's room is at the end of the row. We have to hug the wall so nobody spots us." Ethan listened to their footsteps blend with the faint echoes of the long corridor. He could still hear the engine outside, the soft crunching of tires on the gravel road. Sophie quickened her pace, worried that if they slowed down, that other vehicle might venture deeper into the area. Ethan pressed close to the wall to scan the end of the hallway before gently pushing open the slightly ajar door, slipping inside with Sophie and closing it as quietly as possible. The light from a small lamp on the floor reflected onto Maria's face, causing her to jerk her head up in alarm. Upon recognizing Ethan, her hands trembled and she tried to stand, but her legs buckled, forcing her to lean on the wall. "Why did you come here? Is Sophie in harm's way?" Maria asked, her state a mix of relief and panic. Sophie stepped forward and took her mother's hand while Ethan bent down to support Maria's shoulder. "You don't need to worry about her. She sought me out to tell me she saw my mother alive." Ethan said, his eyes fixed on Maria's face, looking for any sign that Sophie's words were exaggerated. But Maria nodded immediately. She pointed to a cloth bag tucked in the corner of the room and continued. "I saw Ms. Linda on a gurney. She was taking breaths. They wheeled her onto the refuse transport as if she were nobody's family. I didn't dare call the authorities because I knew no one would believe me without solid proof." Ethan lowered himself closer to Maria to hear everything she said clearly. "Are you certain my mother was still breathing?" he asked, and Maria responded without hesitation. "I saw her chest rise and fall faintly. I even saw her hand clench when the transport hit a bump." Ethan leaned back, placing a hand on his forehead, trying to reconcile with what he had just heard. Maria continued her account, her voice cracking as if releasing a fear that had been held for too long. Before that, Helena controlled everything at the clinic. She didn't allow anyone near Ms. Linda, not even the close-knit nursing staff. All files went straight to her for approval. Anyone who asked about Ms. Linda's condition was told to stay away for privacy reasons. When I heard the news that Ms. Linda had passed away, everything happened too fast. No one got to see her one last time. Ethan turned to look at Sophie, who was looking down, her hands still tightly clasped. He turned back to Maria. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" Maria took a deep breath, looking down at the floor as if afraid looking directly at Ethan would make her break down. "I was just a housekeeper. I didn't have the standing to question anything. The whole clinic seemed to be controlled by Helena. I wasn't sure if what I saw at Westford was enough for you to believe, and I was terrified of being discovered. I heard the two men who appeared at the waste management area tell each other, 'Ms. Helena wants everything wrapped up tonight.' After hearing that, I knew I had to go into hiding." Sophie, standing nearby, interjected. "My mom was being watched, you know." For 2 straight days, people stood below the stairs at the boarding house looking up at our door. My mom said we had to keep moving because every time we settled somewhere new, we'd see strange vehicles parked nearby. Maria nodded, confirming Sophie's words, and added, "One time, 2 men cornered me. They spoke as if warning me not to meddle in big affairs. I knew there was no safe place left, so I took Sophie and left that very night." Ethan listened to every word, recognizing that the terror within them was neither feigned nor exaggerated. He looked around the small room Maria was currently occupying, noting the signs that suggested the mother and daughter barely dared to leave for long. "You didn't contact the authorities because you thought they wouldn't believe you?" Ethan asked. Maria nodded, her shoulders trembling slightly. "I had no concrete evidence besides witnessing Ms. Linda being moved. I was afraid they wouldn't trust someone like me, and if I stirred up trouble, I don't know what might have happened to Sophie. Sophie squeezed her mother's hand and looked at Ethan. We moved locations 3 times. Every place showed signs that someone was looking for us. My mother couldn't sleep. I didn't dare go to school. I just knew I had to come to you today because my mother said there was no more time. Ethan felt the weight of Sophie's words settle onto his shoulders, forcing him to reevaluate everything Helena had done over the past months. He remembered the times Helena personally handled paperwork and how she dismissed his questions about the specifics of his mother's passing. Every disjointed piece now clicked together in a terrifying way. "Do you believe Helena was involved in my mother's disappearance from the clinic?" Ethan asked, although he knew the answer before Maria opened her mouth. "I can't say for sure," Maria replied, "but everything was arranged by her. From the time Ms. Linda was admitted until the time of the death announcement, no one knew what was happening inside, except those Helena allowed." Ethan let out a heavy breath as if releasing something he had held back for too long. He stood up and placed a hand on Maria's shoulder to reassure her. "You don't need to stay here any longer. I'll take you and Sophie somewhere secure. From now on, I will handle this myself." Sophie was about to say something when an unusual sound echoed from the hallway outside, a heavy clang like something hitting a metal drum. Maria flinched and instinctively hugged Sophie. Ethan raised a hand, signaling for both of them to remain silent, then slowly moved toward the door. He leaned in to peer through the small gap and immediately saw a figure standing near the end of the row of rooms, their head slightly bowed as if searching for something. The figure moved one step at a time, slowly but deliberately, occasionally looking down at the ground as if following a trail. Ethan quickly turned back and gestured for Maria to hold Sophie closer to the wall. "Sir, that dark-colored vehicle earlier. This sound is similar to when it stopped outside our boarding house," Sophie whispered before Ethan could respond. Maria took the girl's hand and retreated behind a makeshift table to break the line of sight. Ethan looked through the gap again, seeing the figure advancing closer, only a few steps away from Maria's room. Ethan kept his hand on the doorknob for a few seconds to ensure the figure outside the hallway hadn't gotten closer. Then he subtly nodded to Maria and Sophie, preparing to leave the room. He opened the door just wide enough for the 3 of them to slip out, while meticulously scanning both directions of the hallway to avoid an unexpected encounter. Spotting a safe gap, Ethan moved ahead to lead with Sophie in the middle and Maria following, trying to keep their steps as steady as possible. The 3 moved seamlessly through the long corridor, only pausing when the footsteps outside suddenly changed direction, causing Maria to tug at Ethan's coat as if asking whether they should turn back. Ethan shook his head, gently, pulled her wrist and quickened their pace, allowing no hesitation to slow their exit. Just as they passed through the courtyard cluttered with old storage drums, the dark sedan from earlier unexpectedly appeared at the intersection, its headlights sweeping across the small road leading to the refuge yard. Maria held Sophie tightly, covering most of the girl's body instinctively, while Ethan pulled them both behind a rusted concession stand to create a blind spot. The sedan rolled past and retreated down another street, but its return to that exact location solidified Ethan's understanding of the intensity of the monitoring Maria and Sophie had been subjected to for days. Once the sedan was out of sight, Ethan quickly rushed to his vehicle, opened the back door for Maria and Sophie to get in. He closed the door and turned back to face them, stating decisively, "We're heading to Westford immediately. I need to see it all for myself." Sophie nodded quickly, as if afraid time might slip away from them again. Ethan drove the car away from the abandoned market, following the route toward the outskirts of Everglade. He wanted to avoid the main roads where they might be easily spotted, so as he turned onto the quieter side roads, Maria constantly looked back through the window as if fearing that any vehicle that appeared might be the one that had been tracking her all this time. Ethan noticed this but didn't falter. Instead, he became more cautious, continuously checking the rearview mirror. As the city receded, small signs directing traffic toward the Westford waste processing zone began to appear. Sophie leaned out the window, trying to recall the details her mother had shared about the area, and pointed out the road near the dumping ground that led to the makeshift shelters of the unhoused population. As the car entered the dirt road, Ethan slowed down to avoid jarring Maria and Sophie, giving them time to observe closely. Sophie leaned forward, whispering to Ethan that she had heard Maria talk about the temporary shacks built by people living near the waste area to scavenge anything of value, and that her mother believed they had encountered Linda during the period she was brought here. Ethan nodded, continuing to drive deeper into the area where the old warning signs were mostly ineffective. What struck him most was the sporadic sight of temporary camps erected by the unhoused, looking like they were constructed from salvaged wood from the refuse piles. Maria looked out the window, her hand placed on Sophie's shoulder, as if to reassure herself. "Over there," she said when she saw the wide open ground ahead. Ethan pulled the car over to the edge of the road, following Maria's pointing finger. In that direction was a cluster of tents made of nylon and wood, where a few people were sitting around a collection of items gathered from the dumping site. Ethan stepped out first to ensure safety, then signaled for the mother and daughter to follow. As they approached, a few unhoused people turned to look at them with caution. Ethan held out a photo of Linda from his wallet and asked directly, "Has anyone here seen her? Was she ever brought to this area?" A woman with disheveled hair quickly stood up, looked at the photo, then back at Ethan, before pointing directly toward a shack in the corner of the lot. Her gesture caused Maria to move closer to Ethan. Ethan and the mother and daughter followed the direction the woman indicated. Near the shack, a thin, middle-aged man stepped out. He looked at the photo, nodded immediately, and raised his hand to mimic the motion of a chest rising, indicating that Linda was taking breaths but was very frail. He then touched his own chest and acted out calling someone's name, which Ethan instantly understood to mean Linda had called out for him in her faint, fragmented breaths. Ethan bent down and stepped into the shack, examining the few remaining items. A thin blanket hastily folded by someone was placed next to a plastic box containing some miscellaneous items. He touched the blanket and found a few strands of gray hair clinging to it, causing his hands to tremble slightly. He wanted to be certain this was where his mother had truly stayed. As he was examining the area, an elderly man approached, leaning on a wooden stick for balance. He looked at Ethan for a long time, before making a pushing gesture with his hand, as if to convey that Linda had been taken away during a moment of strong wind. Then he pointed into the distance, toward a cluster of old warehouses stacked together, part of the Morton steel factory that had been bustling years ago. Ethan stood up, asking the old man with a firm voice, "They took her in this direction, didn't they?" The old man nodded, his eyes fixed on Ethan, as if stressing the urgency displayed by the people who took Linda. Several others in the camp also approached, confirming with their eyes and gestures that they had seen the group appear in the night, quickly putting Linda into an old transport and driving away from the area. All the details, when pieced together, made Ethan realize that his mother had not passed away as he had believed for 18 months. The truth discovered at the Westford dumping ground not only sparked a fragile hope, but also raised a massive question mark over what Helena had been concealing. Just as Ethan was preparing to step out of the shack, Sophie picked up a small piece of cloth under the tarp near the entrance and showed it to Maria. Maria instantly recognized it as fabric from the blue wool scarf Linda used to wear on days she felt unwell. Ethan took the piece of fabric, holding it tightly in his hand without saying a word, as the sense of certainty returned powerfully. This small piece of cloth confirmed that Linda had indeed been here, and everything Maria had recounted was no longer baseless anxiety. He needed to go to the warehouse district. The old man pointed to where the abandoned Morton steel factory was now being rented out for material storage. Ethan led the mother and daughter back to the car. Before getting in, he turned back and told the group of unhoused individuals how grateful he was that they had correctly pointed out where Linda had been. They didn't say much, only nodded and returned to their shelters, as if offering help was a natural occurrence in a world that seldom paid them any mind. Ethan started the car and turned the nose toward the Morton warehouse district. His determination was clear. Every doubt now had a starting point, and he would not stop until he found Linda. The car sped up on the bumpy road. Maria turned and looked out the back window and flinched when she saw a figure standing on a high mound in the distance. The person was holding a phone, pointing it toward them, apparently recording their actions. Maria placed her hand on Ethan's arm and whispered, "Look behind you." Ethan didn't turn his head abruptly, but observed through the rearview mirror, seeing the strange figure standing still, pointing the phone directly at the car as it drove away from the refuse yard. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and told Maria to stay low. "Keep Sophie close to you. We need to keep driving immediately." Maria complied, and Sophie also pulled her seatbelt tighter. Ethan stopped the car far enough from the Morton Steel factory to avoid attracting attention, then surveyed the entire complex of old warehouses with their dented metal doors and peeling walls. Streaks of light filtering through shattered window panes revealed human movement inside, forcing him to consider a more cautious approach. Maria crouched low to avoid being seen as she spotted the shadows of several men moving across the courtyard between the rows of storage units. Sophie kept her eyes glued to every movement, then gently tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Look there. Those two look like the men my mom saw at Westford." Ethan followed her gaze and saw two men hauling a bin of materials into a secondary storage building. Their physique and gait immediately reminded Ethan of Maria's description. He carefully led Maria and Sophie to shelter behind a stack of rusty containers where they could look through a gap without being spotted. From this concealed position, Ethan watched the two men exchanging documents. Both repeatedly glanced toward the main gate as if expecting someone or trying to ensure the outer yard was clear of strangers. An old transport truck unexpectedly drove in the roar of its engine, triggering a sense of urgency from the group. The two men immediately signaled the driver to take the vehicle deeper into the storage area. The driver nodded and steered toward a large metal door that was slightly ajar. What caught Ethan's attention was a man holding a clipboard nearby, pointing to his watch, urging the crew inside the warehouse to move faster. A few seconds later, a gust of wind forcefully swung the metal door further open. From that gap, a gruff argument echoed out, and Ethan caught one phrase. A voice said, "This time we have to move her sooner. To move her. Any longer, and it might be too late." Hearing the word, her Maria immediately turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with worry. Ethan felt his heart clench. The phrase couldn't be about anyone other than Linda. He moved along the main warehouse wall, trying to find additional clues before venturing deeper inside. When he reached the dirt area behind the warehouse, he immediately noticed a long, dragging track. The trail was uneven and interrupted, as if a heavy object had been dragged by someone who lacked the strength or was moving too quickly. Ethan knelt down to examine it, then looked back toward the warehouse door, imagining that this path of movement might relate to Linda in the frail condition described by the people at Westford. While Ethan continued his investigation, Sophie found something lying under the chassis of the newly parked transport truck. She reached down and pulled out a strip of faded blue wool scarf. She handed it to Maria, who instantly recognized the material and the familiar pattern. "This is definitely Ms. Linda's scarf." Maria said, her hand trembling slightly. Ethan took the strip of scarf from Maria, holding it tightly in his palm for a long time, confirming he hadn't misidentified the clue. Maria looked toward the corner of the warehouse and quickly pointed out several old health devices that had been discarded. Among them were a broken breathing tube, used bandages, and a torn tarp, stained with streaks of strong disinfectant. These items had no connection to the steel factory's operations, and their presence convinced Ethan that this location had been used as a staging point for moving a person requiring care. All these disjointed pieces of evidence coalesced into a single possibility. Linda had not only been taken from the Westford dumping ground to this location, but she had also been moved again while still needing medical attention. As Ethan was observing, one of the men from the secondary warehouse suddenly yanked the metal door shut, blocking the view from outside. This action suggested they were aware of the risk of being seen or were simply preparing for a major transfer. Their haste solidified Ethan's belief that they were about to move Linda elsewhere. He looked in the direction the transport truck had driven and immediately thought of Cedar Hollow, a private care facility that had operated but was abandoned years ago after the managing health organization closed down. It was remote easy to keep information concealed and perfectly suited for transferring an ill person without detection. Sophie gently tugged Ethan's arm when she heard an unusual noise from the opposite wall. A metallic object fell to the ground with a small but loud clang, enough to make the two men in the warehouse turn to check. Ethan immediately dropped low, pulling Maria and Sophie tight against the wall out of sight. The two men stepped out of the warehouse door, scanning the yard and moving closer to the corner where they were hidden. Ethan held up a hand, signaling them to hold their breath and move extremely slowly to avoid making noise. Maria grasped Sophie's hand tightly, ensuring the girl remained absolutely still. One of the men approached their hiding spot, glancing around as if searching for something dropped or someone who had appeared unexpectedly. Ethan bowed his head, pressing his back against the wall so hard he felt like he merged with the shadows behind the containers. As the man got within a few steps of them, Ethan focused intently on listening to his direction of movement. The man stopped near their location, bent down to pick up a metal bar lying on the ground, then turned back toward the main warehouse. Sensing the man was no longer paying attention, Ethan gently tapped Maria's shoulder and signaled for all three to move along the wall's edge toward the side gate. This was the only path to exit the warehouse complex without crossing the main entrance where more people were gathering. He put Sophie first, placing his hand on her shoulder to guide her, while Maria stayed close behind, not daring to check the warehouse again, afraid the man might suddenly turn around. As they neared the side gate, the sound of the transport truck tires grinding on the ground from inside the warehouse convinced Ethan that the individuals inside were preparing for the next journey, most likely to Cedar Hollow. Ethan knew they had to leave immediately before the transport left Morton Steel. He pulled the side gate open just enough for Sophie to slip out first. Maria followed, and Ethan kept his hand on the gate, ensuring it made no noise. Just as the three were about to escape rapid footsteps, and a hurried voice from behind made Ethan turn halfway around his hand, still on the gate, as he realized a figure from inside the warehouse was heading straight toward the... Ethan swiftly closed the side gate and signaled Maria and Sophie to stay tight against the chain-link fence running along the Morton Steel factory perimeter. The three rushed across the patchy dirt and gravel, trying to keep their steps light to prevent noise. Ethan led the way, his eyes continuously scanning the main warehouse direction in case anyone emerged. Maria kept Sophie close, occasionally glancing back, fearful someone was pursuing them. Reaching the end of the fence where a narrow path led out to the secondary road connecting to the highway, Ethan paused briefly to check. Seeing no unusual signs, he gently pulled Maria and Sophie out of the warehouse complex. Once they reached the car, Ethan opened the door quickly but still checked the rearview mirror before sliding into the driver's seat. Just as he was buckling his seatbelt, he saw Sophie tug sharply on his sleeve and point toward the mirror. "Sir, look, the transport truck is leaving the warehouse now." Ethan quickly adjusted the rearview mirror, seeing the truck exiting the Morton gate at a much faster, desperate speed than when it arrived. The headlights flashed intensely, seemingly trying to tear through the dust cloud of the old industrial area. Maria covered her mouth, and Ethan immediately understood why they were changing locations. And if the old man's words were accurate, Linda might be right inside that truck's cargo area. Wasting no time, Ethan turned the steering wheel and accelerated. He maintained a safe distance, making sure not to reveal that he was trailing them. The transport truck turned onto the small road leading directly toward the low woods west of the city. The atmosphere inside the car was so tense that Maria leaned back but strained to keep her eyes on the road ahead. Ethan focused entirely, his left hand on the wheel and his right near the gear shift, ready to adjust if the transport truck suddenly disappeared from view. "Are you sure we can keep up?" Sophie asked, her voice betraying her nervousness. "Just maintain distance. We can't let them spot us." Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on the transport truck's rear as it plunged deeper into the woods. Maria opened the glove compartment and pulled out an old paper map she always carried. Her hands trembled, but she managed to trace the routes. Cedar Hollow is northwest of the woods. The road they're taking heads right toward it. There are a few old health facilities nearby that no one uses anymore. Then they are absolutely taking Ms. Linda there, Ethan stated, his voice firm. He slowed down when he saw the transport truck turn onto a small branch road, then decelerated further, allowing his car to hide behind a curved, sloping section of the road. "Stop here, please," Sophie suggested when she saw a secluded stretch that would keep them from being seen. Ethan nodded, pulling the car close to the embankment, then waited a beat to ensure no one was behind them. He could hear the wind rustling through the trees, and faintly in the distance, the engine noise of the transport truck fading as it rounded another bend. Sophie leaned in to listen closely, then whispered, "My mom said Ms. Linda used to sing when she was scared. If she's nearby, maybe we can hear something." Maria placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, a mix of worry and hope in her expression. As Ethan pulled out of their hiding spot and continued to follow, he saw the reflective gleam of the transport truck's rear lights through the trees, an unmistakable sign. This told him two things: they were moving very fast, and Linda was being transferred with unnatural haste. "We don't have much time left," Ethan murmured, as if reassuring himself and the two people in the back. Maria suddenly leaned down and picked up a scrap of paper that had blown in near her feet. "Ethan, look at this." He took the paper with one hand. It was a torn file label, but the logo printed in the corner was unmistakable: Cedar Hollow Healthcare. Ethan gritted his teeth, realizing all his suspicions were correct. This piece fell from the transport truck. Maria was certain, as she had seen it drop from the turbulent airflow caused by the vehicle ahead. They really are taking her to Cedar Hollow. "We'll get there before they can do anything else," Ethan declared, pressing the accelerator. Rounding the final bend leading to Cedar Hollow, he saw the half-collapsed gate of the old care facility. The entire area looked long abandoned, but the tracks of the transport truck driving in were so fresh, the dust hadn't settled. Ethan stopped the car behind an embankment to conceal it. He meticulously observed every movement inside. Two men jumped down from the back of the transport truck, opened the rear doors, and exchanged hurried words with a person standing in the yard of the facility. The person waiting held a flashlight, sweeping the beam over the ground to scout the path. They weren't talking loudly, but their movements were frantic. "They're getting ready to move her to the back of the main building," Maria murmured faintly. "Do you see that Sophie clutched Ethan's jacket? The flashlight. They're looking for a path to push something." Ethan leaned back to observe another angle. Through the dusty, opaque window of the building in the rear, he saw a faint movement. Although unclear, he knew it wasn't random. "Someone is inside that building," Ethan said. "It could be my mother." Maria covered her mouth while Sophie was caught between hope and fear. Ethan grabbed the car door handle, preparing to step out. "Both of you stay low behind the car. Don't move until I signal," he instructed. "What are you going to do?" Sophie asked. "I'm going to confirm Linda's location first. If they prepare to move her again, we won't get another chance." As the transport truck turned around, preparing to leave the facility, Ethan knew this was the critical moment. He opened the car door very slowly and stepped out, observing the movements of the people in the yard. Maria hugged Sophie and kept her head low to avoid the flashlight beams. Ethan took a few steps, using the shadows of the trees to shield himself from detection. The people in the yard were focused on securing items in the truck's cargo area, so no one noticed the dark zone where Ethan was maneuvering. He moved close to the crumbling wall surrounding the building, his eyes never leaving the window of the rear building where the movement had appeared. He had to confirm it was Linda before attempting to get her out of there. Ethan pressed his body against the large tree trunk located near the side entrance of Cedar Hollow, keeping his breathing as shallow as possible so as not to alert the individuals moving in the front courtyard. Through the gap between two trees, he clearly saw three figures pushing an object on a makeshift gurney toward the auxiliary building. They exchanged quick words, frequently looking back as if afraid someone was following. The fabric covering the gurney gently swelled with every tremor as the wheels rolled over the uneven ground, causing Ethan's heart to thump with every beat. Maria stood behind Ethan, clutching Sophie to her chest and pressing herself against the least noticed shadow area. She strained to hear every sound emanating from Cedar Hollow, trying to pinpoint Linda's location. Sophie clung to her mother's arm, her eyes fixed on every movement in the yard, a strong intuition telling her that what they were searching for was incredibly close. The old door of the auxiliary building suddenly swung open slightly, a dim yellow light illuminating a small section of the hallway inside. At the same moment, a low-pitched hum drifted out with the breeze, causing Maria to freeze. Ethan. That's the resonant sound of care equipment. She whispered, her hand clutching his coat as if to affirm they had come to the right place. Ethan peered through the opening, seeing a shadowy figure walk down the hall and pull what looked like a temporary medical kit into an adjacent room. There was no longer any doubt. This was where they had relocated Linda. Ethan signaled for silence and moved away from the tree. He walked toward the courtyard, sticking close to the stone wall to avoid being caught by the sweeping flashlight beams. Sophie followed closely behind, trying to step exactly where Ethan had trod to avoid making noise. Maria followed last, her hand still shielding Sophie, a reflex of a mother constantly fearful of losing her child. As they moved deeper into the courtyard, Sophie suddenly stopped short. "Mr. Ethan, I hear something like singing." She spoke softly, but the tremor in her voice was undeniable. Ethan halted, completely cocking his head to listen. In the desolate quiet of Cedar Hollow, a chain of fragmented vocalizations echoed, unclear whether they were actual words or just rhythmic, labored breaths. But it struck Ethan like a shock wave, as if he were hearing his mother's voice again after all those months. He led the two of them around the neglected, overgrown planting beds. On the damp ground behind them, fresh tire tracks were still clearly visible, leading directly toward the crumbling stone wall at the far end of the yard. Those tracks showed that the item being moved was heavy, and they had transferred it from the auxiliary building to the main building in just a few minutes. Reaching the stone wall, Sophie spotted a wheelchair placed near the back door of the main house. The chair was facing away from them, and the front of it was covered with a thin gray blanket. What caused all three of them to hold their breath were the thin, dry legs of a woman visible beneath the edge of the blanket, motionless but distinctly human. Mother. Maria gasped, unable to maintain her composure. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the shoulder of the person in the chair. The gray blanket slipped, revealing Linda's face. Her skin was pale and deeply hollowed, but her closed eyes still twitched slightly beneath the lids, as if struggling to open. Maria placed her hand on Linda's cheek for confirmation, then choked up. "Ethan. It's her." Ethan knelt down, grasping Linda's hand. The hand was cold, but still strong enough to clench when it felt his warmth. "Can you hear me?" "Mom," Ethan asked, his voice thick but steady. Linda tried to raise her other hand and placed it on his hair. Though the gesture was slow and heavy, it was enough for Ethan to understand that she recognized the person in front of her. Sophie stood beside them and took Linda's other hand. She looked at the hand, then at Maria. "She looks exactly like the person who was moved through Westford." The girl's voice trembled with emotion, but it was enough for Ethan to confirm that every clue from the very beginning had been accurate. Without hesitation, Ethan stood up, pulled the blanket back over Linda to minimize attention, and checked the stability of the wheelchair frame. The chair was old, but the wheels still moved. "We're getting my mother to the car immediately," Ethan said. Maria nodded, double-checking Linda's feet to ensure she wouldn't be harmed during the transfer. They had barely pushed the chair away from the stone wall when headlights suddenly swept across the ground outside Cedar Hollow's main gate. The light was so bright it illuminated every old step. "Someone is here," Sophie whispered, holding tight to the wheelchair. Ethan immediately dropped low, pulling the chair tight against the stone wall to avoid being caught in the direct beam. The sound of an SUV's tires crunching on the ground grew louder. Maria pulled Sophie back behind her, never taking her eyes off Linda. Ethan peered through the gap between two large stones and looked out. A dark SUV was parked right outside the main gate, 2 men stepped out of the front doors, while a third remained inside, rolling down the window and sweeping a flashlight beam into the courtyard. Ethan turned back and whispered, "They got here faster than I thought. Both of you stay right with Linda. I'm going to find a path to circle around and get you all out the back." But before he could move, the flashlight beam from the SUV window swept directly into the stone wall area where they were hiding. Sophie squeezed Linda's hand tightly and murmured, "Mr. Ethan, they saw—" Her sentence was cut short as the shadow of one of the men who had just exited the SUV began heading straight toward them. Ethan crouched down near the wheelchair handles and pushed Linda along the side path leading to the rear of Cedar Hollow. He kept most of her upper body pressed against him so the light sweeping from the SUV in the courtyard wouldn't hit her frail face directly. Linda subtly trembled with fragmented breaths, and Ethan continuously whispered, "I'm here." "Mom, don't worry" is a way to keep her conscious breath by labored breath. Maria led Sophie along the edge of the stone wall, clearing a path for Ethan. "Stay right next to the wall. When we reach the slope, turn left and you'll see your car." She instructed, her eyes darting toward the courtyard to ensure no one was catching up. Sophie ran right beside her mother, instinctively grabbing Maria's hand. Every time she heard a noise from the main gate, a protective reflex. Ethan pushed the wheelchair faster as the ground began to slope downward. The old chair shook violently, but it remained sturdy enough to support Linda. As soon as he saw his car parked beneath the trees, he accelerated toward the back door, opened it, and helped Maria and Sophie get in first. He lifted Linda into the back seat, settled her into a stable position, and pulled the safety harness across her body. Maria immediately used both hands to brace Linda's back to prevent her from leaning too much when the car shook. Ethan jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine instantly, but he kept the lights off. He slowly backed up meter by meter to ensure the tires didn't make too much noise. All four remained absolutely silent, hearing only the gentle hum of the engine. Just as the wheels touched the flat road near the bottom of the slope, the loud roar of an engine from behind startled the three in the back. The SUV from before had found another way around and appeared right at the top of the slope. "Ethan, they spotted us," Maria said, her voice filled with panic. Ethan didn't reply, simply accelerated backward a few more feet before steering sharply right, merging onto a side dirt path. The SUV sped down the slope toward them, quickly closing the distance Ethan was trying to maintain. The dirt road was narrow and bumpy, but Ethan knew this was an advantage because the SUV would struggle to maintain balance at high speed on the surface. He turned the steering wheel sharply left when he saw a break in the trees. The path was so narrow the SUV would be forced to slow down to enter it. "We're taking this route," he said, flooring the accelerator to utilize the narrow opening. Their car squeezed past the trees and dropped onto a lower road. The SUV was blocked by the path's width, forced to slow down and adjust its steering angle, allowing the distance between them and Ethan to widen. With the bright headlights no longer piercing the rear window, Maria exhaled with relief, but kept her hand braced on Linda's back. Sophie turned back to check, then said, "Mr. Ethan, I think they're slowing down now." Ethan checked the mirror, seeing the glow of the SUV's lights receding into the distance. "We're not completely safe yet. They're just delayed by the terrain," he said, then turned on his headlights to merge onto the main road directly ahead. Once on the main road, Ethan eased the throttle to make the car look like a normal moving vehicle, avoiding drawing attention. "What do we do now?" Maria asked, her voice trembling from the combined stress of the escape and monitoring Linda's condition. "We need to gather all the evidence and contact the attorney," Ethan said. "Hand me the reserve phone." Maria rummaged in the seat pocket and gave him an old phone. Ethan quickly activated it and had Maria recount every detail she had overheard that day at Westford. "Tell me the exact words," the two men said about Helena. Ethan prompted, his fingers rapidly typing a summary on the screen to send immediately to the Ward and Cole law firm. Maria took a deep breath, then said, "One man said, 'Ms. Helena wants everything wrapped up tonight.'" The other replied, "Don't let anyone see her again. Just move her as instructed." I heard every word clearly. Ethan typed it exactly as she said, attaching the strip of wool scarf, the location of the Westford dumping ground photos of the Morton warehouse, and details identifying the individuals who had appeared at those locations. Sophie continued to look out the rear window. "Mr. Ethan, I don't see that vehicle anymore." They disappeared from the main road. Ethan checked, confirming the SUV was out of sight. They might be finding a different route, but this distance is enough for us to head safely to the office. The safe office, Maria asked. "It's a location my family uses to store important documents and for emergency contact. Helena doesn't have access to that place." Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel as he mentioned Helena's name. All the scattered clues over the past 18 months were now sufficient for him to understand the extent of her involvement in fabricating Linda's death. As the car approached the city outskirts, Sophie still didn't stop checking the rearview mirror. "Mr. Ethan, I think we should turn left at the next section, just in case they show up behind us again. I don't want to be caught in that situation." Ethan nodded and prepared to make the turn. The city of Everglade appeared in the distance, the streetlights stretching out as if opening the way to safety. Ethan took a deep breath and said, "We'll go to my family's office and file all the evidence. This time, I want everything brought to light." But just as the car neared the intersection leading downtown, Ethan checked the rearview mirror and saw a powerful light suddenly sweep across the back. Then he tightened the wheel as Sophie urgently stated, "Sir, I think there's a car coming." Ethan steered the car into the underground garage of the Ward family office, where the access system had been remotely activated as soon as he sent the emergency signal. As the steel door slid open, the internal security team appeared, helping to transfer Linda into the safe room located deep within the auxiliary structure. This was a facility Ethan's father had used to protect family members in high-risk situations, and it featured its own dedicated medical team on standby 24/7. 2 medical personnel took charge of Linda, placing her on a specialized cot and checking her vital signs, while Ethan stood right beside the bed, his eyes never leaving his mother. "We'll work to stabilize her condition," the nurse said, placing a monitoring device on Linda's wrist. Ethan nodded, exhaling a sigh of relief as if a portion of the heavy burden that had been pressing on him since finding her at Cedar Hollow had lifted. Maria and Sophie stood near the door, watching every movement in the care room, their faces still etched with the tension from the recent pursuit. Once Linda was stabilized, Ethan left the medical room to meet with attorney Cole, who was waiting in the small conference room next to the stairwell. Cole placed a sealed evidence bag on the table. "I have the wool scarf, the cloth scrap from Westford, and all the notes Maria recalled," he said. "We will cross-reference every detail to compile the filing for the investigative body." Ethan sat down across from Cole, his gaze revealing exhaustion but unmistakable determination. "I want to review all the medical files Helena provided me during my mother's supposed treatment. I need to cross-check every timestamp, every signature, every certification record." Cole opened his laptop, accessing the encrypted digital archive of the Ward family. "Ethan, this is the copy of the death certificate for Ms. Linda filed by Helena with the clinic in the civil office. Do you recall signing any of these documents?" Ethan stared at the scan on the screen, squinting. "No, I've never seen this document before. I didn't sign any paperwork that day. I was in Seattle meeting with the investment board." Cole rotated the screen for a side-by-side comparison. "The timestamp on this document aligns exactly with the day you were absent from California. If you didn't sign it, who did?" Helena. Ethan replied, his voice heavy with each syllable. "Or someone she hired." Cole nodded and opened another document. "This is a sample of your signature taken from various financial transactions. A forensic coordinator from our support team has reviewed it and noted discrepancies in the handwriting on the death certificate. It slants slightly to the left and the stroke consistency is off. She forged my signature." Ethan said the words heavy with disbelief. Before Ethan could continue, the security team entered. "Attorney Cole, federal authorities have received our request. They are en route to the Ward mansion. They want us to confirm Helena's likely location." Ethan nodded. "She's at home. If she notices we've been gone too long, she'll try to gather everything and leave." Maria stepped forward. Ethan, I believe Helena became aware of the situation at Westford and Morton sooner than we thought. She might be making arrangements to disappear. She won't get the chance, Ethan said, and instructed the security team to open a communication channel with the authorities at the Ward mansion. At that very moment, Helena was hastily collecting jewelry and documents she deemed crucial. Every movement was frantic, from yanking open drawers to throwing small boxes into the expensive handbag placed on the chair. She constantly checked her phone screen, hoping for a message from the individuals she had hired, but the screen only glowed with a low battery warning icon. As Helena entered the storage closet to retrieve the remaining jewelry boxes, the sound of the front gate buzzer rang out. She froze her shoes sliding slightly on the tile floor in her surprise. She rushed to a small window near the stairs, gently pulling back the curtain to look out. Before her eyes were 2 federal authority vehicles and 1 local patrol car parked right outside the gate. "This can't be," Helena muttered, then turned back to the room, desperately trying to lock the door, but the key slipped from her trembling hand. She bent down to retrieve it, but just as she stood up, a voice amplified from the gate speaker echoed Ms. Helena Ward. "We have a warrant to search the premises and require your full cooperation." The storage room door suddenly rattled as an authority officer demanded she open it. Helena gasped, looking around, but there was no other exit. She let the key drop and placed her hand on the doorknob, slowly pulling it open. Moments later, Helena was led down to the living room. Her face was pale, lacking the polished poise she once maintained in public appearances. An officer read out the investigation rights while she tried to remain composed, but her eyes repeatedly flickered toward the main door, hoping someone would come to her aid. At the investigative room in the department office, Helena sat at a metal table, her hands resting rigidly on the surface. The investigator placed a thick folder on the table containing photos from Westford Morton Steel Factory and footage extracted from the camera system at Cedar Hollow. He opened the first page and slid it toward Helena. "Do you recognize this woman in the wheelchair?" Helena looked at the photo. It was Linda, frail, pale, but clearly taking breaths. Helena's hand moved slightly. The investigator didn't miss the detail. "How do you explain this image? That couldn't possibly be her," Helena stammered, but her eyes lacked their usual sharpness. The investigator turned the page, presenting a detailed statement of private payments Helena had made through an anonymous account, fees for the clinic waste removal charges, and other payments to the group who had appeared at Morton. "Do you still deny your involvement?" he asked. Helena looked down, then up, then down again. The harsh interrogation lights shining directly on her made it difficult to evade. The investigator placed one final document on the table, a copy of Maria's overheard statement, along with an image from the Morton warehouse showing Helena's silhouette near the exit on the day Linda was moved. "Do you have anything you wish to say before we proceed?" the investigator asked. Helena tilted her head, trying to avoid the light, and raised a hand to stroke her neck, her hand slightly shaking. An officer standing nearby gestured that he was ready to escort her to the detention area should she refuse to cooperate. In the Everglade District Court, the hallways buzzed with the hurried footsteps of citizens and the media as Ethan pushed the wheelchair, bringing Linda closer to the courtroom door. He kept both hands firmly on the chair's handles to ensure his mother didn't shake, while Sophie walked right beside them, gently holding Linda's wrist to help her maintain balance after months of forced, constant movement. Maria stood a few steps behind them, directed by the court coordinator to the witness area, where she prepared to deliver the entire chain of information she had memorized during the days she spent in hiding. As the hearing commenced, Attorney Cole presented the panel with signature comparison documents accompanied by the reconstructed timeline of events from the Morton Steel Factory to Cedar Hollow. Every stopping point was backed by photographs, physical evidence, and corresponding testimonies which clearly exposed the entire conspiracy. The court's forensic representative detailed the severe discrepancies in the medical records Helena had submitted, pointing out that the documented progression of Linda's condition did not align with her actual state when she was found. The spectators in the gallery held their breath as a compiled video from the Morton warehouse camera system was projected, clearly showing the shadow of a conscious elderly woman being transferred at the time. Helena appeared in the defendant's dock, placing her hands hastily on the table's edge to steady herself. She lacked the confidence she once displayed at public events. As the judge read through each count of the indictment, from fabricating documents to interfering with medical procedures and orchestrating Linda's transfer, Helena bowed her head but couldn't conceal her growing distress. The prosecution demanded the maximum penalty due to the long-term consequences and the trauma inflicted upon multiple parties, especially Linda and Maria and her daughter. Ethan turned to look at Linda as the reading of the charges continued. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes slowly tracking the words as if trying to fully comprehend what had been done to her over the past 18 months. Sophie held her hand, leaning in to whisper, "I'm here with you." Grandma and Linda responded with a faint but recognizable squeeze of her hand. The jury returned after a brief deliberation and pronounced Helena guilty, sentencing her to the maximum allowable penalty within the state's prosecution guidelines, while also demanding an expanded investigation into those who assisted her in moving Linda from the clinic. As the verdict was announced, Helena cast a weary gaze down at the table while two authority officers approached to escort her out. Ethan wheeled Linda away from the courthouse amidst the continuous flash of cameras. The security detail cleared a path ahead and behind, and Sophie raised a hand to shield Linda's eyes from the light as they moved through the long corridor leading to the courthouse's rear exit. At the safe house, Linda was brought into the main living room, where Ethan had already placed the old piano she used to teach him on. Sophie sat down at the keyboard, placing her hands on the first keys, while Maria prepared a light meal in the kitchen, exhibiting a rare sense of peace after the long, stressful ordeal.